by JFK North are where people like Darren struggling with addiction go to for detox. But Darren says he's afraid if he goes in for detox, he won't come out. $7,000 a week, a costly drug habit for Darren. It's now down to $700. We've changed his name and we've altered his voice to protect him and his family.
I'm Darren. I'm 35 years old. I'm a father of 3 kids, and I'm married, and I'm an addict.
Actually, he's a father of 4, using drugs for more than 20 years. Darren, are you high right now?
No.
When was the last time you took drugs?
Yesterday.
What was it?
Fentanyl.
Why do you get high?
I could give you multiple answers to that, but I'm not a therapist. But I would say to run away from my emotions, probably.
Does it help you?
No.
Why?
Because before I know it, years of my life has passed, and they're just gone.
How does that make you feel?
Sad, like I'm not doing enough for my kids, like I'm trying to break the cycle, and I don't want them growing up seeing me like that.
When did you start taking drugs?
Around 14,
What did you start with?
marijuana.
Walk me through the progression.
Okay, so around 14, I started smoking marijuana. Dibbled and dabbled a little bit around 17, 18, and cocaine, ecstasy. Now, by the time I did all those drugs, a lot of the hysteria you hear about those drugs really aren't as bad as people would make it seem. So it's like you would be able to do it for a week, and then you'd be fine the next day. So my first run-in with opioids, I remember vividly. One of my friends pulled it out. I was 17 at the time. It was a Percocet. And this was years ago, so this was before people really spoke about opioids. And he was like, hey, you want a piece? And I'm like, well, what is that? And he's like, it's just like weed. It gets you like 10 times higher, that's all. And that was my first encounter with opioids. At the time, it was a little bit too much for me. So the same thing with weed, like, you get a little bit too high, but when you have all your friends around, eventually you'll build up a little tolerance. Now, what I didn't know at the time was your body would eventually start needing it. And then that's kind of where the progression started. So when you don't have it, it's literally like you're dying. That's what you feel like. Your body just shuts down. You can't control your bowel movements. You can't hold anything down. You can't drink water. Even though you're dying of thirst, you're going to throw up everything. It's going to look like The Exorcist. It's going to just be green bile all the time. You just take a little sip of water, and that's what it's going to be. You're not going to sleep at all. You're going to have the shakes, hot, cold. You're going to be sweaty constantly, but you're going to be freezing constantly. You might actually die depending on how far your addiction has gone. Your heart might just give out, It's a pretty bad process.
Does that scare you?
Yeah, it scares me all the time.
So why not stop? We'll get to Darren's answer shortly, but first, meet YL Paul.
I enjoy living now.
Like Darren, Paul's habit began years ago.
I started off with a little drinking wine, a little smoking marijuana, little psychedelics, and then pills came involved, and then it progressed from that into different other drugs that had a little bit more of an impact. So that was cocaine, a little heroin. And, at some point, not seeing that it was a problem, seeing it more as a lifestyle.
The lifestyle came to a halt that Paul needed. What set you still?
Incarceration.
How long were you incarcerated?
For this period of time, it was 45 days, so it was, You know, it's interesting with that because there are people that go to treatment. The diversity is what it is about. However you get it, that will give you an impact about a change or a thought is what it's about. And I needed to be sat still.
So you were incarcerated for 45 days?
Right. So I think that would have been the same time as somebody might go into treatment, some shorter, some longer. But you know, the reality is that was what worked for me. That's what I needed because I think I was a little too arrogant to go to treatment just as an individual because I didn't think I had a problem. So being sat still, I got an opportunity to look at this thing that was going on in my life and realize like, this is not what I want. I don't want to be where I don't have freedom, that I'm confined and being told what to do, how to do it, and when to do it.
A fresh perspective gives him new insight on solutions.
So we need to be able to address the different problems that are within our community, within a treatment facility, so that we could feel more comfortable with opening up about what's going on. Because drugs are just a symptom of a deeper problem. So we have issues in our families of abandonment, abuse, poverty. And those things have an impact, and we want to escape through the drugs.
Escape through opioids. For Darren, he escapes with FettyWap, a street name for fentanyl.
Because I need it. I literally cannot go without it. Once we get into a week, I'll start losing. Once we get into 2 or 3 days, I'll start not being able to control my bowel movements, throwing up, all that. Once we get into a week to 10 days, I'll start losing my whole being because I won't sleep the whole time. So after that, I'll start hallucinating. I won't be able to tell what's real from what's fiction. And, it could be a complete hallucination, but to me, it seems completely real.
Russian roulette with a lethal powder, a runaway train that he can't stop. Why can't you stop?
So there's multiple factors involved in that. As far as why not stop right now? Okay, so when we look at it from a perspective as I need to stop, I know that in my head, but I need to be there during the day for my kids. I don't have 6 months to lay around and put everything on my wife. I need to be there. I need to guide them, help them with school. I can't reverse the clock. So if they need me there and I'm not there, I can't be there.
His life and family on the line. Dr. Gordon Johnson, a retired pathologist doing lots of work with the T. Leroy Jefferson Medical Society, says drug addiction is a disease and must be treated that way as if it were cancer.
Just imagine you have someone close to you in the prime of their life. They get this illness, and it is an illness, and it's something they can't control, and they get just a little bit to tide them over, but it's that fentanyl, which is so powerful, and it just depresses their respiration. This is something their body is asking for because of those receptors that have received it before and change the way they're motivated. It's not in their control, but now just a little extra of this will just stop them from breathing. And if someone's not right there to reverse these tendencies of this drug, then they die.
Your next hit could be your last. You have a wife and beautiful children. Does that matter?
Of course. My wife and my kids are everything to me. So it's been a process trying to figure out ways to try to get off of it. So that's where we're at right now.
And what are you figuring out?
I think the best way is to wean down and then go from there. Whatever happens, happens.
Weaning off opioids may not be as easy as it sounds. Lyle Freed is a board-certified addictions professional and an international certified alcohol and drug counselor. He also runs Recovery Church Treasure Coast.
Well, I've been in the treatment industry for mental health and substance abuse for a little over 20 years.
His recovery became one of research.
Let's talk about your personal experience and what you've been through and where you are today. Very passionate about helping other people get to where you are.
I was in a different industry altogether. I was a graphic designer, graphic artist, and did fine arts, and it was very fulfilling for me for a long time. But I found myself in the throes of addiction. It started off as, like you said, how did I know? For a long time, it seemed like if I really just wanted to stop, I could, until it became interfering with my life in general, and then I couldn't. And I realized that I was, as they say, powerless, and I needed help. So I did. I went to treatment. That's where I met a doctor from Holland who explained to me the neurons and the synapses and all these things going on in my brain. I said, wow, that makes perfect sense. How do you fix it? And he says, oh, well, I'm telling you what's wrong. I don't know how to fix it. Well, that was not sufficient for me, and thus began my quest. So when I got into recovery, I began digging into research, which is how I found Dr. Blum and other pioneers in the field to understand how to address the deficiencies in my brain. We talked about the metabolism issue, and I remember when I was a teenager having my wisdom teeth out, they tried to put me under. They put me on a drip, and they said count backwards from 100. Well, when I got to about 50, they're like, something's wrong, and they turned up the drip, and they said now count backwards, and I got to 75, and they said, oh my gosh, you should be out. And so we did it again. And then he says, now count backwards. No, the room began to spin, and I said, oh, now I'm out. Well, the problem is I woke up in the middle of the surgery. Yeah, I had cystine and impacted, so they were literally with a hammer chiseling in my mouth, and I woke up in the middle of it because I had metabolized the sedative so well that it didn't last. So that was problematic. And I began to see right then and there that I didn't respond to certain medications the way other people did. And that left me with a need to get more to get the same effect. So that also later I learned was related to my dopamine deficit. I have what they call reward deficiency syndrome. My brain doesn't receive or produce as much dopamine as the average person. So my sense of completeness, satiation, or joy from the same things that you might find joy in. You might see a beautiful sunset and think, wow, and I do too. It just doesn't last for me. I don't get as high of a peak, and it's not as sustained as it is for normal people. So my brain began to seek ways to fill that, and it found them. They just were unhealthy ways, and they began, again, to need more and more and more to get the same effect. So when I began to realize that there were solutions, and a lot of it for me, I took a path, my connectedness on the spiritual level was extremely important to me, my connectedness to others, accountability, understanding that the traumas of my past, I have a history of trauma as well. All of these are factors which the genetic factor only heightened. So why is it that two people can experience similar experiences, and one has this response and one has that response? And that's where genetics come in. It's not, genetics are anywhere from 30 to 70% of the picture. The rest of it is the epigenetics, the environmental factors, the things you go through in life, exposure. I mean, we talk about the 85% of the Native Americans that have that predisposition. Well, then why is it that, does that mean 85% of them are addicted? Well, the truth is, if you never take the first drink or the first opiate, you'll never experience the addiction to that substance. So there's got to be an exposure as well. And this is why the reason I spend so much time talking about the nutritional and genetic side is because I believe it's the most neglected. And it's quite easily resolved. So the cognitive behavioral stuff, the trauma therapies, those are all wonderful and necessary for many people. But there are some people who simply had a sports injury. They never had any trauma. They had a wild, wonderful upbringing, and they never had any desire to use a substance. But then they got an injury. And because of that genetic predisposition, once they were exposed to the painkillers, their body took over, their brain took over and said, I need more, 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 more.
Addiction sets off some neurochemical actions that affect a person's biology and their brain. Freed devotes his time studying his own past to find solutions for others.
Oh, well, it's complex. So obviously cognitive behavioral therapies are well known to be helpful. A lot of what gets left out is the nutritional side of what we experience. There's a big spiritual component, and then as we were talking about earlier, the genetic predispositions and some of the things that we have to be on guard for prior to as a preventative, and then moving forward to avoid relapse.
So let's start with this. What is dopamine and how does it affect the brain?
Dopamine is a basic satiation neurotransmitter. They call it a feel-good neurotransmitter, but when you do things, your reward system in your brain is designed to help you do things that are good for you. So you get thirsty, you drink water, and your brain says that was good, and dopamine is released. We procreate, we have sex, and it feels good because to keep the species going, and so dopamine is released. So things that are good for us, our brain was designed to reward us with that dopamine release so that we would feel good and repeat healthy behaviors.
How does opioid increase dopamine levels?
Well, it does it in a few ways, but largely it activates that dopamine action, and then the dopamine receptors are filled. So you have these neuroreceptors that are waiting for the signal to come in, and opioids release about 9 times the normal, what we call net release of dopamine. So what would normally be a healthy, satisfying function or activity would release a maximum of about 100 is sort of the measure for dopamine. Well, opioids can release up to 900. So it's 9 times the normal release of that satiated feeling.
So saying that, how does the brain respond to pressure seeking? That's it, right? I mean, or just a little bit more?
Sure. So a few things happen with opioids. First of all is it hits that high level. Our brains are very intelligent. So it begins to recognize that too much dopamine is a bad thing, and it'll shut down some of those dopamine receptors. So that's why someone will take that opioid and receive that large hit of dopamine, but then the next time they start at a deficit because their brain has, not only as they peaked high as it drops down, so when it drops down to below baseline, you now need more to get the same effect, but also some of the receptors have shut down to protect the brain. And so then it needs even more in that sense. So that's what they call the chasing the dragon. You need more and more and more to get the same effect.
Hence the addiction.
Correct.
And that's the process of addiction that starts already, or?
That's largely the process of addiction. So there's a biological and then there's a psychological components. Both are tied into that dopamine action.
How do you know when you are in active addiction? People would say, well, I'm not addicted. I can stop anytime I want. I'm just doing this because I need it. Or I'm doing it because I want to do it. There's nothing wrong. I can stop tomorrow if I want.
Right. There are some measures, but the truth is that the individual who is addicted often doesn't know. And that's the difficulty. Some of the signs are, needing more to get the same effect, doing things that if it creates disruption in your life and your relationships, those are all signs that it's out of control. Using for an extended period of time, using for reasons other than prescribed, using more than prescribed, and we all have our justifications. And some of them are legitimate to a point. So someone may say, well, it's not resolving my pain issue, so I need more than what the doctor told me. Well, that may be true, but it's still a problematic behavior.
Are there certain groups of people who are more susceptible to opioid addiction?
Sure, and to addiction of all kinds, really. So we know from genetic studies that Native Americans, 85% of them have the DRD2 factor. So there's different genetic risk factors, and DRD2 is simply a dopamine marker, if you will, a site in our genetic makeup that is related to the dopamine, and there's something called an allele, a risk factor at that site. And 85% of Native Americans have that single risk factor. 1/3 of all citizens in our country do. I think it's about 58% for Hispanics. There's different, genetic groups that we know have higher predispositions, but a full 1/3 of our country has just that one of several markers.
Where does the black race fit in that scale, if that's not a question that So I know I'm throwing that at you.
Yeah, and I think that they're at about 72%, if I remember correctly, 72% of all African Americans. And so again, that's just with the DRD2 factor. There are other factors that come into play. And for African Americans, there's something called the COMT. And what that is that they metabolize their dopamine at about 4 times the normal rate. So when they receive the medication, that dopamine effect, as well as some of the other effects, are metabolized much quicker. So the average African American will need more of the same prescription, more of the same substance to achieve the same effect as somebody else, or at least achieve it for any lasting time, simply because their metabolism is going to run through it quicker.
Let's talk about this saliva test that can determine if you have a predisposition to an opioid addiction, because I want to take the test.
Okay.
How does that work?
Well, it was developed by Dr. Kenneth Blum, and he was an early pioneer in the research of genetics related to addictions, overeating, alcoholism, etc. And so through decades of research, starting in 85, I think it was, and he had actually done some before that, but published research from then on, he was able to determine some basic markers, the most prominent markers for a predisposition toward addiction and some other obsessive compulsive behaviors. And then through that, weighted a scale, basically. So the more risk factors you have, the more likely you are to experience addiction and some of the other obsessive compulsive behaviors. So what it does is it simply is like any other genetic test, but it looks more specifically into certain areas rather than a broader ancestry type thing. It looks specifically at those predispositions, the ones that have been evidence-based to show that you might have risk factors there. And so it tests 4 dopamine genes, a dopamine transporter gene. It tests for the 5-HTT2, which is your serotonin gene. Most people have heard of serotonin for depression. MAOA, which is a transporter as well. It has to do with uptake for your neurotransmitters, as well as, again, COMT, which is a catecholamine-based issue. It looks at these various things that are related to that brain reward circuitry and where you might have risk factors, and it weighs it all out and gives you a scale, a rating of your risk factors.
So if you have a predisposition to an opioid addiction after you do this test, what's the next step then?
Well, depending on what you learn from that, you start to see that you have certain neurotransmitters that may not be functioning properly. You can have overproduction as well. I mean, when we talk about dopamine, I mentioned earlier how the brain shuts down with too much dopamine. That's because too much dopamine is what schizophrenia is. It's an overproduction of dopamine. And that's why a drug-induced psychosis looks just like schizophrenia, because that's what it is. It's too much dopamine in your brain. So what we begin to do is we look at those risk factors and we help to feed you the things that will produce a better balance. It's all about the dopamine homeostasis, along with some of the other neurotransmitters, but it really all boils down to dopamine in the end of the story. We can talk about how the other ones affect it. There's something called the brain reward cascade. So the 5-HT2, your serotonin receptor, then feeds into the mu opiate receptor, which then feeds into the GABA A, GABA B, and dopamine. So that cascade of neurotransmitters, the bottom pool, what end result we look at is the dopamine. And that's why we talk so much about that. It's not as though the others aren't involved, they're just not as crucial to the end result. So if we see that we have dopamine balance, dopamine homeostasis, a healthy, not too much, not too little, then our desire to go seek that. See, our brains are pretty well designed. Our body and brain recognize when something's missing, and we'll go look to fill that void. Unfortunately, if we have a genetic issue where we're constantly dopamine deficient, then we'll never get there without some interventions. When we do find that intervention, whether it be opioids or other substances, our brain says, yes, that's what's been missing, and it keeps returning to that, even to its own detriment. And so if we can recognize that in advance and give them the proper interventions, and sometimes that's simply changing diet or a simple supplement, all of our neurotransmitters are based on amino acids. So if we have the right stuff going in, our brain can use it to produce the dopamine or other neurotransmitters that we need. So if we know in advance that there's a deficit, we can address that through nutritional approaches and other things. Nutrition isn't the only one, but it's a main one.
Somebody wants to go and get that saliva test done. How much does it cost?
So that particular test that we were talking about is called the GARS, Genetic Addiction Risk Score, that Dr. Blum developed. That one, I believe, is around the $250, $300. There are other tests you can do that have some similar information, and they're all, they range from $25 to $2,000 and change. You know, it depends on how elaborate you want to test, how deep you want to dive, and how much information you want to get back. There's one done by a group called Atlas Genetics, and it gives you a 75 plus page report that is very extensive, and then a summary at the end that says do this, don't do that. And so it really depends on the depth of information you want as to how much you're going to spend.
Should insurance be paying for a test like this?
Insurance doesn't pay for much in the way of genetic testing to date. You know, it's still fairly new relative to a lot of other things. So I imagine they'll catch up to us when they see the value as a preventative measure, as well as a relapse prevention measure, and also as a treatment measure. If we know what deficits may exist in your neurotransmitter activity, we know specifically what to treat, how to help alleviate that deficit.
There is help out there for people that are addicted. But what I'm hearing now is it goes back to everything that goes back to money.
Unfortunately, and there are some things you can do to sort of, there's some paper tests you can do to get an idea where you are in that moment. Those are great for where you are in that moment, but you got to realize that what we experience when we answer these rating scales on these paper tests is that we're talking about at that moment. So if we've had life stressors, so stress reduces your endorphins. Reduction of endorphins increases cravings, right? So stress can be a factor that's maybe not there next week, but is there today. So as we answer a paper test, we're giving you in the moment capture, which is valuable, but not the same thing as understanding our long-term need based on genetics. Two different things.
What are the responsibilities of insurance companies and treatment centers in the opioid crisis?
Two different categories. So I think obviously the responsibility of the insurance company, you would think, would be to be able to provide the right kind reimbursement for the care that will best serve their patients, their clients. So what will keep them from relapsing? And the fact that we're not looking at these things is concerning to me, that it's not being reimbursed. There are some options in some treatment environments to provide nutritional guidance, assuming that they have the right nutritionist working on it. Most nutritionists aren't trained for the brain, but more for healthy eating to keep you from being obese and experiencing diabetes and those kind of things. Most nutritionists don't spend as much time on the brain-based issues. I think the treatment centers absolutely need to be providing this information as well as the access to this nutrition while people are with them. We refer to it as the third leg of the stool. Again, think about it. If you've got a brain that is caught up in, ADD, ADHD, or heavily depressed or reward seeking when they're supposed to be paying attention to their therapist, how much are they really getting out of what could be a wonderful therapy if their brain's not properly balanced, right? So what we want to do is feed them the things they need to have a well-balanced brain so that all the other modalities are more effective. Those therapies would be much more useful and much more effective if the brain is in the right state.
How has insurance companies hurt or helped patients during this pandemic?
Well, I'm going to get myself into some hot water here, but I believe that the insurance companies are looking at how to help themselves, not how to help the patient. They're looking at the bottom line. I see people denied extended care when they absolutely, positively need it. In the insurance industry, we're required by state law. I used to own a treatment center, and I am required by my licensing to provide care based on certain criteria. So I have to provide this level of care, partial hospitalization, let's say. And there's an ASAM criteria, Addiction Medicine, Society of Mixed Addiction Medicine, that I'm required to follow by licensure. But the insurance companies say, well, we're not going to pay for that. Well, legally, I have to provide that. That's what it says by law. That's the level of care that I must provide. And they're saying, no, we're only going to pay for outpatient at this point. we're not going to pay for that. I said, well, I'm in a bit of a thing here because you're telling me that I can't do that. And then if I do, they'll call it fraudulent billing because I'm providing a higher level of care than they have authorized. So now the state says I have to provide this care because that's medically what's required. The insurance company says we're only going to pay for this. And if you provide that level of care, that's fraud. So I would have to get them to agree to allow me to provide what I believe is the medically necessary care and then only get paid for, or not get paid at all, only get paid for the lower level of care. So I'm stuck as a provider in this weird position where I have to violate, you're telling me I'm going to be committing fraud or in violation of my licensure. And that's it's strictly driven by dollars. And it doesn't really make sense to me. I would think that the goal of insurance companies would be to help people get well and stay well so that they wouldn't have to return to care later on. So some of that follow-up and ongoing care, some of the proper care in the beginning can help prevent relapse. Matter of fact, some of these nutritional approaches, there's very strong evidence to show that it greatly reduces relapse. Now, can we be sure that a patient will follow that regimen when they leave? Well, we can't be sure heart patients will take their medication properly. Diabetics are famous for not following. When you've got a chronic condition, it requires ongoing regular checkups and care. That's not provided for addiction care, right? We see that for diabetics, they're followed up. We see that for skin cancer. We see that for heart conditions. We see that for a lot of other chronic conditions, but we don't see it in the behavioral health field because they don't see it as medically as they do these other things. It is definitely, there's a biochemical, a neurochemical, there's a medical component here that needs to be addressed as a chronic condition, which it's stated as. And if we continue to treat it as a one and done and ship them off and good luck, then we're going to continue to see high rates of relapse.
Let's talk about the nutrition part of it. Because you just said that you want to educate a lot more on the nutrition part of it. Mm-hmm. What's the right foods to eat?
Well, so amino acids are part of a protein based, right? So we have to have enough protein in our diet. If we are eating protein on a regular basis, the odds of our brain receiving the nutritional inputs it needs are much greater. Specific things that you can eat, there are certain foods that will produce certain neurotransmitters. So your particular diet, there's a woman by the name of Patty Rice who developed something called the pro-recovery diet. And it outlines basic healthy foods to eat to feed your brain properly. There's a group called the Alliance for Addiction Solutions, and they look just at how to address addiction through nutritional inputs. There's another woman, Christina Veselak, who teaches at the Addiction Academy, the Academy for Addiction and Mental Health Nutrition. And they teach people how to look for these specific things. Each person's needs might be a little different based on their genetic makeup as well as their life experiences and what their needs are. But typically proteins, your nuts are wonderful resources. Eating just a handful of almonds every few hours can feed your brain wonderfully. Bananas are known to contain dopamine. Almonds are great. There's a variety of food sources we know that we draw these things from. So we talk about the serotonin issue. So anything that has L-tryptophan in it, turkey's known for it. There's a lot of other foods that are known for it. Tryptophan, when we talk about serotonin, hits at the 5-HTT2. 5-HTT2 is for 5-hydroxytryptophan. Hydroxytryptophan will feed it. So L-tryptophan, anything with a tryptophan base, and that's a lot of foods. I mean, again, bananas are a great source, very handy. Most people like them. Almonds, other nuts. Nowadays, meats, obviously, turkey, chicken, fish that are high in omega, which also help. Those are all great resources.
At what point does the individual take personal responsibility for their own addiction?
Well, at all points. And so here's the difficulty. The addicted mind is not capable of making good decisions, or it wouldn't be an addicted mind. That's sort of one of the criteria of addiction, is that we're doing things that are harmful to us, even though we know they're harmful to us, right? And it's not as though they want to be doing it. That's where that pleasure reward system of the brain has taken over. So what happens is you have a portion of your brain in the limbic system that's telling the prefrontal cortex, this part of your brain where your decision making and your willpower And all these other things that should come into play are now being overridden. So your limbic system, your pleasure reward center, is telling your prefrontal cortex, you need to do this to survive. That dopamine deficit looks like a survival issue to it. Remember, that's what makes us drink water. That's what makes us eat food. That's what makes us procreate. And it's telling the prefrontal cortex, you need to do this. So now our decision making is not good. That's one of the signs of addiction. So how do we ask them to take personal responsibility? Well, once we get them stabilized, once we get them some treatment, then certainly they need to take ownership. But they also need accountability. This is why the impaired professional programs for pilots, for attorneys, for doctors, for the medical field are so successful, is because they are held accountable for years, 5 to 10 years. They're in a program where there's regular accountability for them. We need the same thing for everybody with that condition, not just impaired professionals. That ongoing accountability, that checkup, and that follow through will be extremely helpful. And that's, again, why they are so successful. And there is a period of time, there's that, what we call neuroplasticity, that healing of the brain, that settling down of that neurotransmitter activity, particularly when we feed it properly, that will allow them to have increasingly reduced relapse tendencies, increasingly reduced cravings. And so as this, over time, and when we get to that 5 and 10 year mark that are so well known, then certainly by then you're almost in a new way of life and a new way of living, and the need for those ongoing controls and accountabilities and checkups are pretty well resolved.
Darren faces a long road ahead. Is that important for you to get off the drugs?
Very.
What would it take for you to turn your life around?
I don't know.
Darren says he tried to stop before and has little faith in the rehab system.
Like I said before, I think it's a for-profit system. But yeah, I am gonna fight this on my own. That's where I'm at right now.
Doctors say you can't fight this on your own.
You know, I really don't know what to say to that. But I was in the hospital one time, and I know a nurse told me that they have people who come in there with a fentanyl withdrawal who die. And I thought in my head, why not just give him a shot of fentanyl, save his life right then, and worry about it later? Because there's so much of a stigma that it's not worth saving somebody's life.
The stigma around what?
Around addicts. How could you die of withdrawal in the hospital? Just give him the fentanyl and wean him down. Wouldn't that make more sense than to let him die from withdrawal?
Do your kids know about your addiction?
So my kids at this time, I'm lucky enough that they're young enough that they don't know. Now, one day, hopefully not, but if it continues, one day will come where they would realize that that's what's going on, but hopefully I can resolve this situation before then. Now, as far as your family being important, and that I can see that would make anybody who doesn't have an addiction feel like, well, if somebody was important enough to you, you're going to stop. But either way you look at it, pain is pain. For example, you're an American, but if I shove a knife into your stomach and I twist it long enough, you'll trade out on this country. That's what it is. Pain is pain.
In your experience from the black male perspective, you say that there is so much more that can be done to help those who are struggling with addiction.
Yes, I believe there's more about education. I believe in our community that there needs to be things such as maybe devices that will help people that may go through an overdose, that it should be in more of the local stores. I think we need to educate, people and family members how to assist. because of the fact that there's a stigma with this whole thing of being an addict, and the gentleman was speaking about it earlier, just that in itself, like, people don't want to say my child, my brother, my sister, my mother, my father. We want to be in denial. We want to hide that. We want to push it under the rug, so to speak, even though it has been more awareness going on as a society. But in our community, the shift has happened only because of the fact that it is being more with a light put on it. We don't have the facilities in our community that are dictated towards us culturally, because there's a thing with the treatment facilities that are good, but each of them are going to be different based on the group of people that are in there, right? So we need to be able to address the different problems that are within our community, within a treatment facility, so that we could feel more comfortable with opening up about what's going on. Because drugs are just a symptom of a deeper problem. So we have issues in our families of abandonment, abuse, poverty, and those things have an impact, and we want to escape through the drugs.
Is there a light at the end of the tunnel, and if so?
I believe there is. I believe things like what we're doing right now, like what you're doing, which is to put light on the subject, to go and talk to people such as myself, other people that have experience, have been impacted, and then letting people know that there's a way out, that there is a way out, because we need to know that, because it's not always the doom and gloom that we have been projected with. And part of the issue is that because of the things that are going on within society today, we don't have the same reverence for society, people like police and people of authority, because we're being killed. So here's an issue that goes on where maybe I could have came to you at some point in time down the line to say, I need help. Well, I'm afraid to come to you now because I don't know if I'm going to come out alive. So when we're looking at that, we have to be able to, within our community, to make it safe, to make it be viable, with information that we are being able to go to somebody and say, I have a problem, help me. And we need to do that in our churches. We need to get beyond the stigma that it is attached with the fact of an addict. Because we did that same thing when AIDS was in our community. We didn't want to talk about it in the church. We was like, oh, that's a bad subject. We don't do that. You got to just be abstinent. That's not real. People have human needs and natures and feelings that come about, and they want to deal with them. So we need to be able to recognize in the places that we come together to talk about those taboo subjects.
We are now in 2022. If you continue using fentanyl, do you think you'll be around in 2023?
I can only hope so, but I don't plan to keep using it. I just plan to wean down and then stop. That's pretty much what my plan is. But as far as leaving my family and leaving them to go for a however long program, I think that's out of the question. Financially, emotionally, all of that. I just don't think that's possible.
What a powerful, powerful session. Thank you guys for joining us. YL and Mr. Free, thank you so much. I'll give you a brief update on Darren. I spoke to Darren a few days ago, and Darren says that he is trying to get the therapies and the treatment that he needs in order to kick this habit that not a habit, it's addiction that he has. So he's really working hard towards it. So we wish him well, and we hope that he gets, all the help that he needs. We've got a lot of questions, so we're going to jump right in with some of these questions. YL, let's start with you. A question for you. Can an abuser pinpoint the moment when they have crossed the line from occasional user to abuser? And how can the medical community prevent that progression? YL, I think you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. Lyle hit on this during the session that we actually don't know, because we go from it being something we do for fun or something that's being done with friends to belong and be a part of. And then one day you need it. You don't realize that you do. And then you start to do things as the disease progresses and the addiction becomes larger to get it. You know what I'm saying? We will sell our soul at some point to get that next hit, that next drink. Well, drinking maybe not to the same degree as opiates, crack, heroin. You know, they have a different connection in terms of the attraction to it and the pulling us in. As far as medically, I don't know if there is anything that could be done that says, hey, you're crossing the line here. That may be something that Lyle would definitely be more to answer, but I don't know if there's some type of medicine or some type of research or whatever is going to be done maybe down the line that says you are susceptible to crossing the line from smoking marijuana, which is usually what's called the gateway drug, to being a full-blown addict. Okay, so that,
I'm sorry.
okay.
Go ahead,
No,
Lyle.
okay. No, that's just what I have to say on that question. Go ahead.
So, Lyle, I'm going to let you take over from there in terms of the medical community. Can they prevent the progression?
If you recognize it in time and are able to get someone to see it, and it's sort of like Weil said, if they're not aware, or they're not willing to hear it, or they don't believe that they're crossing a line, or that they're at the edge of that line, then it's going to be a difficult conversation. But absolutely, and that's why we have those criteria that we work by. And if you hit so many markers, you kind of, it's like a score sheet, and you reach a point at which you're at risk. You're definitely at risk. And let's face it, with the things that are in the street today in the forms of the opioids we're seeing, it doesn't take much exposure to be there. It's a pretty quick ride from first use to full-blown addiction. They don't like that term anymore, but I'm old school and I still say that's what it is. So, you know, but it doesn't take much. And that's, you know, it's the same thing with when we saw crack hit the roads. If people were using cocaine on and off, you know, successfully, right, in their eyes, and then first time they smoked crack, they were done, right, because it's got that much more of a hit in that dopamine system. It just grabs you and it doesn't let go. So it's a pretty quick ride, like Wael was saying, from I think I'm just having fun to, oh my gosh, what has happened?
So, Lyle, do you think there is an evolutionary benefit as to why some people have a genetic predisposition to pleasure-seeking substances?
Well, I mean, sure. I think about it. If we do things to survive, and we're driven to do that, you know, from before, you know, the hunter-gatherer stage, that kept us alive, right? That's the whole point of that pleasure reward system, is to keep us alive. The deficits, I don't think necessarily serve so much of it, unless you were in a society at the time. So like, again, the hunter gatherers who were constantly nomadic and had to keep moving to move on, mm-hmm. Right? So I can see some advantage to that, to where you don't get satiated and sit and camp when you need to be moving on and finding your next, you know, hunter gathering place, you know. So I could see some potential advantage there.
So you talked a lot about dopamine in the piece. So we've got a question here about dopamine. When dopamine receptors become inactive because of opioid addiction, would that also mean that things like eating food and drinking water will become less pleasurable as well?
Sure. There's a point at which when you're long-term exposure to high levels of dopamine input, that typically happens with the things like ecstasy, methamphetamine, crack, the ones that take you way up there. We had mentioned in the piece 900 for opioids. Well, those will take you up to 1200. And so when you have that overproduction to that dramatic of an event for extended periods of time, you can end up with what we call anhedonia. And that's the inability to feel joy and pleasure because of a dopamine deficit, not because you can't produce it necessarily, but because your receptors are shut down. And there are people, unfortunately, few that don't have that neuroplasticity and don't come back.
And Lyle, would you say then that's why people also then eat very little? You know what I'm saying? Because of the fact of what happens with the dopamine and the seeking out for the ultimate high, they would go buy maybe a Yoo-hoo and some chips. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, they only seek the energy at that point because they've already filled the satiation. So they don't need food. Food is irrelevant. There's no drive for food because that portion of the brain has already been met.
Right.
So, YL, you were incarcerated. You spoke about that, and that was a changing point in your life. Do you think incarceration is a possible solution to get opioid abusers the help that they need?
No, I don't, because I don't think that it's designed that way. I think it's designed to house people. I don't think that they actually have the programs and the staffing, such as people like Lyle and other people that are in this field. You know, I did groups, I did counseling, you know, I was certified by the state to do it. We're not in there. You know what I'm saying? You have guards in there. You have people that are basically there to keep people in line. So without having programs that are designed to talk to people such as Lyle and other medical people such as Lauren as to the effect, okay, like, hey, we need to know how to separate the criminal from the addict. The addict does criminal acts to feed their addiction. They're not truly going out there for the excitement of crime. When there are people that's their drug, they enjoy robbing, they enjoy causing havoc. The addict is going to do this to feed the addiction. So they're not focused on that in incarceration. They're housing you. They may have some drug treatment programs, but the depth of them are to a certain limit, because again, you're in a community that is influenced by different diversity of individuals and things of that sort. So now we have to recognize that and start to look at, how do we separate the addict from the criminal? How do we recognize to put staff in there that's going to help the addict so that they don't become repeat offenders, to lower the recidivism that goes on with incarceration?
So I have a question here that's, in our chat box here, that this is a really interesting question, and I'm going to have you answer it, YL, and then Lila, I want you to also answer it as well. How can someone with addiction relate with others without being ashamed, without feeling ashamed?
You know what? When we're in it and we're with people that are doing the same thing, shame is nowhere in there. Shame, abandonment issues, or shame and embarrassment, excuse me, is what I wanted to say. We're not concentrating on that. We're trying to figure out how to get that next high. So I don't have any shame about what I would do. And how can you judge me when you're in the same place? If we're in the crack house getting high, yeah, I might have a moment where I look at you and say, you're worse than me, but that's so that I could justify to myself the continuation of what I'm doing. I don't think that there's any shame that comes about. I think shame happens once we stop using. And I'm not talking about the moment of just not getting high. I'm talking about when we do the work on ourselves, the spiritual work, do the process of recovery, then we are going to be able to address the shame and guilt of the things we did. But we also are being knowledge. We're giving knowledge to understand what we did during the addiction is what we did during that. It's the work after that's important.
And Lyle, you can answer that as well.
Sure. So I think there's work being done both on that and the incarceration issue. I mean, I volunteer at the local jail here in our county. And so we know that it's getting better. It's got a long way to go. And diversion programs have popped up a lot to give them treatment instead of incarceration. But again, there's a lot of work to do there. But as far as the being able to approach people without the shame, we're working on that, and it's a long process. And one of the things a group I'm working with is working on putting up more billboards about the normalcy of this. Because let's face it, with the rate of overdoses, we should be fairly clear that a very large percentage of our population, let me tell you, everybody that I talk to, whether they know it or not, knows somebody who's experiencing it. Mm-hmm. And so it is unfortunately normal. It's common. And so once we start to get out there and understand that, the same thing, I do a lot of work with veterans and first responders, and they don't want to talk about their post-traumatic stress, right? Because it's just something you don't admit. Once we get more information and more education out there that this is normal and seeking help is okay, it doesn't mean you're weak. It means you experienced something and now we need to deal with it. And so it is really a public information campaign is about the only way we're going to see this really change.
So we got another question here. Can we say that friends can easily influence someone to be an addict or personal lifestyle? Can you comment on that, YL?
I don't think that they have that type of influence in the sense of making you an addict. I would go back to what Lau said. There's some predispositions. There's some genetics that are more in factor. I think that we have an influence as to using. You know, if you're around people that are getting high, you want to become a part of. You don't want to be termed a square or a sucker or any of that. So you will go against your own conviction and family values to be a part of. And therefore, that's how we get sucked in. And that's how we then get all the way in of not knowing where the line is from fun to being a full-blown addict. Because, you know, I grew up with some people that never got high. Then it's funny, I grew up with some people that didn't get high. And then later on, they ended up getting high for whatever reason. Like Lau said earlier, they smoked that one thing, if it was crack, meth, or whatever it was, and then that was it. They were, oh, I found my heaven. So now we look at that and it's to say, I also have a choice, but I have to recognize that there are some other things that are involved in my becoming an addict. You know, we got trauma, we've got the shame, we've got the, you know, the guilt, all those other things that go on within the network of it that have more influence, I think, than just a friend offering you something and making you an addict. You have to have a curiosity also that has an influence there.
Lyle, we have another question for you. If I am someone in recovery and I want to reduce my chances of a relapse, who should be responsible for providing the resources that I need to stay clean? That's a good question.
Yeah, it is. And it's a little bit loaded because it all depends on the process to what got you where you are now. And so you'll notice that we call, you'll hear a lot of some providers are called recovery centers, some are called treatment centers. And those are really two different things. Treatment is the acute stage. Recovery is what you do with that you learned in treatment. And so being able to give them the tools. So a good treatment center will provide a recovery map. And most of them now are starting to learn that they provide some ongoing, they call them alumni services, but they're really ongoing supports, check-ins, and other things. So there is some guidance on that recovery journey after the treatment phase. Who's responsible? I think we all are. I mean, as a society, we have to realize that this is a society-wide problem, and we need to be more proactive. And it's like Wael was saying, where, you know, we're not where we need to be with, you know, institutions that are providing incarceration without the help to get them out of what got them there in the first place. Is that their responsibility? Well, it's just wisdom. I mean, I assure you that most counties don't want to fill their jails up any more than they have to. And if they want to stop doing that, you know, I know our local sheriff says, unfortunately, we're now the largest mental health and substance abuse provider in the county, not by choice, but because people commit crimes as a process of their mental health and substance use issues. That's why we're seeing drug courts and mental health courts and veterans courts be so successful, is because they are that intervention stage. Who's responsible? We all are. But the truth is, the individual experiencing this substance use disorder needs to have some responsibility, but they also need the accountability to maintain that responsibility. They're not capable in the early portion of being fully responsible. Remember, there's that neuroplasticity, that healing process. They're not there yet. So the cravings are still pulling. And how do they, you know, what kind of supports do they need? Well, your family can be support if they're healthy enough. Your recovery community, some people do 12-step programs and other peer-based programs. And while I mentioned the church is starting to catch on. And that's why we have things like Recovery Church, because your mainstream church doesn't know what to do with people like us. And so there's a lot of resources, but really the answer is everybody. The individual themselves have to have some level of responsibility. If we do it all for them, they're not going to get very far. But we do need to hold them accountable and provide the resources.
So having said that, you know, we have a great question here from Joe. What is the pathway to sobriety for people like Darren, who inpatient rehabs are not an option for him?
Well, you know, he says it's not an option, and the truth is it may be. And so there are, for financial reasons, there's long-term faith-based therapeutic communities that allow you to at least get away from the influences, like Wael was saying, for a period of time. For him, it was 45 days, right? There are ones that will let you at no charge stay there for 9, 12, 24 months to allow yourself that healing time and process. There are some state-funded, unfortunately, they're not very many, they're not very good. because we as a society haven't done much to actually fund them. There's a lot of talk about the Portugal model, and the Portugal model is that they decriminalize drugs, and when you get arrested, they don't legalize them, they decriminalize them, so that when you get arrested, instead of getting sentenced to jail, you get sentenced to treatment. Well, that's a 2-year program that includes life skills, job training, and actual job responsibilities, accountability. It's a 2-year program. Now, is our society here in our country willing to invest what it takes to put 2 years into these individuals to get them to the other side of this? So that is where we need to be. It's not where we are, but there are pathways, there are outpatient. And for him in particular, that's what medication assisted treatment is really all about. People who, who can't find a way to something else, there are government programs that will pay for him to get onto medications that will help him, that are the opioid blockers. It's an agonist and antagonist all at once. Your Suboxone, Sublocade, all the different versions of it that will help him avoid the relapse and avoid dying from it. Are they 100%? Are they foolproof? Are they for everybody? No, but it is an option for people like him that he should be looking at, because there are resources to pay for that.
And I think also the 12-step programs have been viable and helped many, many people. And I think there has to be a willingness to participate, because there's a saying, one addict helping another without parallel. So we understand that when you go there, there are people who get it. Going back to your question about shame, like when you're in an environment where the people that are like you, that could tell you things that you think that you have said, oh, I will never tell anybody about this. And then you find out there's so much more going on with other individuals. It lessens that. So we also have those programs that are available that are free, but you have to be willing. Those require individuals to want to do the work. So this hits on like what Lyle was talking about earlier, like the spiritual work. You'll have a sponsor, you'll be guided through the 12 steps, then you're going to do other things. And some people might have to go get professional assistance after and not feel bad about that, because that's what's needed, because you may not get that extra piece from your sponsor, doesn't have the experience. But we know that the 12-step programs are a vital area for people to get help.
Absolutely. They have a long record of success. The problem is, of course, that we're dealing with a different beast. I'm very involved in the 12 steps, and I believe him very much, but he's got to get past that point to where he can actually get in there and avoid the physical. See, he's talking about the withdrawal symptoms he can't get through. He's got to find a way to get past that. Medication to get him past that. Then from there, he's able to get into a 12-step environment where he can get that peer assistance and move forward.
Right. But then we also have to be mindful and worry about, with the MAP, programs that they are getting on, that doesn't become the new addiction. That there are people that go there and get involved for many years who are on the methadone program, went in to get down off of the heroin, and now they've got that methadone habit, and they're unwilling to get off of that program, and they won't do the medical withdrawal, the medical assisted withdrawal, bringing them down because they've become dependent on it. So it's kind of that twofold thing that we have to worry about here when we recognize that is there, but it also has a hindrance to a certain degree.
Well, guys, thank you so much. This has been such an interesting session. It's powerful. Lyle and YL, thank you guys so much for joining us. Everybody else that joined us as well, we hope you learned a lot tonight. I certainly did. Thank you all again for joining us for our Opioid Prevention and Education Series 3 about how our genes might influence our susceptibility to opioids. Now, we will have a QR code at the end of this webinar to obtain your free 1 credit for CME or CE credit. Just wait for the code at the end. Thank you guys again, and we'll see you again next time.
Have a great night.
Take care. Thanks. Okay.
On behalf of our organization, we would like to thank you for electing to take this opportunity to learn. We also would like to thank our team and panelists for helping us make this project possible. If you would like more information on T.D. Ward Jefferson Medical Society, please visit our website at tljmedicalsociety.org.